weak. That is what Randy Savage believed. And when the Macho Man said something, he meant every single word of it. He did not throw phrases around carelessly. He did not make accusations without reasons. When Savage pointed at a man and said that word, it was the end of a long process. A verdict reached after careful observation, careful measurement, and the application of a standard that very few people in the history of professional wrestling have ever truly understood. But before we get to the weak ones, let us talk about the strong one. Let us talk about the man himself, because you cannot understand the judgment without first understanding the judge. Randy Savage was one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever lived. He was electric in a way that very few performers ever managed to be. He was explosive. He was brilliant inside the ropes. He planned every single move he ever made with a precision that bordered on obsession. He scripted entire matches before the bell even rang. He trained harder and thought harder and prepared harder than almost anyone else in that locker room. He never switched off. He never relaxed into comfort. He was the Macho Man at all times. Backstage, in the car park, on the road between towns, at the dinner table at the end of a long night. That was not just a character he performed for the crowd. That was a code. That was a whole way of living. And if you want to truly understand why Savage was so great, you need to understand something else first. You need to understand what he hated, because what Savage hated tells you everything about what he valued. And what he hated more than anything else in this business was weakness. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the Macho Man's world, use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype so more fans get to see it. It only takes a second, and it makes a real difference in getting this story in front of the people who need to hear it. Now, weakness. To most people, weakness means small muscles or a slow sprint down the aisle. To Randy Savage, that meant absolutely nothing. Savage did not care about your biceps. He did not care how fast you could run to the ring or how impressive your body looked under the arena lights. What he cared about was your backbone. What he cared about was your preparation. What he cared about was your respect for the sanctity of the business that had built everything around you. To Savage, weakness was showing up to a match without having planned every single second of it in advance. Weakness was letting politics lift you to the top instead of pure, honest, genuine hard graft. Weakness was caring more about how you looked in the mirror than how you performed when the pressure was on. Weakness was playing it safe and comfortable and clean when the business demanded that you bleed. That was his code, and he applied it to everyone without exception. He gave no special treatment to his closest allies. He looked the other way for nobody. He judged every single person in that locker room against that standard. And over the years, 10 names kept coming up. 10 men who, in Savage's eyes, fell measurably short. Thus 10 men he labeled weak in their own very specific and very different ways. Some were weak in heart, some were weak in focus, some were weak in preparation, some were weak in the backbone required to face difficult truths directly. But all 10 fell short of the Macho Man standard, and Savage was not shy about saying so. We are counting them down today. All 10 of them, starting at number 10 and going all the way down to number 1. And by the time we reach that final name, you will understand the Macho Man's mind in a way that changes how you see everything he ever did in that ring. This is not just a list video. This is a character study of one of the most intense, most driven, most brilliantly obsessive minds the wrestling business has ever produced. Pull up a seat. Here we go. Before we reach those 10 names, we need to build the foundation. We need to understand where Randy Savage's code actually came from, because it did not fall from the sky. It was forged over years in a very specific environment, and that environment left marks on him that never faded. Savage did not grow up inside a polished, well-funded corporate wrestling machine. He grew up on the outlaw circuit. His father, Angelo Poffo, ran International Championship Wrestling, known as the ICW. This was a tough, stripped-down, no-frills promotion. It operated entirely outside the mainstream wrestling world. The big companies did not acknowledge it. The mainstream media did not cover it. There was no safety net. There was no corporate structure to fall back on when things went wrong. It was the kind of place where you brought everything you had every single night, because the alternative was irrelevance and nobody was going to rescue you from it. That environment shaped Savage completely and permanently. It drilled into him the belief that survival in this business required unyielding intensity every day, with no room for exceptions and no tolerance for excuses. When your career is built on a foundation like that, the comforts and protections of a bigger company do not soften you. They make you suspicious. They make you watch the people around you very closely. They make you notice who is working and who is coasting on the structure around them. And Savage noticed everything. While other wrestlers could leave their characters behind the curtain at the end of the night, Savage never did. He stayed in character at all times. Backstage, in hotel lobbies, on long drives between venues. He was always the Macho Man, always switched on, always ready. Some people found that genuinely exhausting to be around. Savage found it absolutely necessary. To him, dropping the character, even for a moment, was the beginning of dropping the standard. And dropping the standard was the beginning of weakness. You could not be half committed committed and call yourself a professional in Savage's world. It simply did not work that way. Then there was the craft. The craft was what Savage called the work of professional wrestling when it is performed at its highest possible level. The craft meant planning your matches in meticulous, painstaking detail before you ever stepped foot inside the ring. It meant scripting the entire thing in your mind long before the music hit and the crowd started responding. It meant researching your opponent, understanding their strengths and their limitations, and in building a performance that would account for both. It meant treating every single performance as if it were the most important thing you had ever done in your life. Because to Savage it was, every time, without exception. Not some nights when the crowd was big and the cameras were rolling. Every night, small hall or sold-out arena, television or house show, it did not matter. The standard stayed the same. Other great wrestlers had a different approach. Was technical masters like Ric Flair could walk into a match and call it in the ring as things developed naturally between two experienced performers. That was a respected skill and it produced great work. But Savage did not fully trust that approach. He needed to know the plan before the match started. He needed to have the structure locked in tight so that nothing was left to chance. Anything left to chance was an opportunity for weakness to creep in and ruin what he was trying to build. And Savage was not willing to allow that. When he found someone who did not share that level of commitment and preparation, he did not stay quiet and move on. He formed a view, a hard, clear, permanent, unforgiving view. And over the years, those views sorted themselves into four types of weakness. The first was the political manipulator. These were performers who used backstage connections and corporate relationships to stay at the top of the card, rather than earning that position through genuine work rate and ability. They relied on the system rather than their craft. The second was the underprepared athlete. These were performers who arrived at a match physically capable but technically unprepared. People who needed someone else to carry the creative and structural weight of the performance for them. And the third was the aesthetic narcissist. These were performers who prioritized how they looked over how they actually worked in the ring. People who confused an impressive physique with an impressive career. People who treated the mirror as their most important tool. And the fourth was the technical pacifist. These were performers who played it safe every time, who never took a real physical risk, who always chose the comfortable, controlled option over the explosive, dangerous one, who never bled for the business because they were too cautious about what it might cost them. Those four types built the framework through which Savage viewed the entire wrestling world. Now let us count down the 10 men who fell into those categories. Here are the 10 wrestlers Randy Savage called weak, starting at number 10. Number 10, Hulk Hogan, the Mega Powers. That name alone brings back one of the most iconic partnerships the wrestling world has ever seen. Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan standing side by side during the expansion era of the WWF gold trunks in red and yellow. Two giants sharing a stage that felt like it was built for both of them. To the audience, it was a dream team. Two of the biggest names in the industry walking together, carrying the company on their shoulders, selling out arenas across the country. It should have been everything. For the audience, it largely was. But the Macho Man was watching more closely than anyone in that crowd could possibly know. Behind closed doors, Savage was already forming his verdict on his partner. And that verdict was not kind. It was measured and it was specific and it was damning. Not physically. Savage was not dismissing Hogan's size or his conditioning. The weakness Savage identified in Hogan was located somewhere far deeper than the surface. It was in his heart. And it was in his willingness to use the corporate structure around him as a protective shield rather than standing alone on his genuine merits as an athlete and a performer. Savage believed that Hogan's long dominance at the top of the company was not built primarily on superior work ethic or exceptional athletic ability. He believed it was built on Hogan's skill at manipulating the people and the power structures around him to serve his own position. Every rising star in that company was a potential threat to Hogan's spot. Every performer climbing the ladder was someone Hogan needed to manage and contain rather than welcome and encourage. That pattern of suppression rather than elevation told Savage everything he needed to know about what Hogan was really made of beneath the red and yellow presentation. In Savage's eyes, and that constant need to keep others down rather than inviting the challenge of genuine competition was the clearest possible sign of a yellow streak. Because a truly strong performer does not fear rivals. He welcomes them. He measures himself against the best available competition, and he wins or loses on his genuine merit. What Hogan did, according to Savage, was the opposite of that. He managed the competition away before it could truly test him. And that, in the Macho Man's world, it was not the behavior of a strong man. It was the behavior of a man who already knew he might lose a fair fight. The tension between them eventually produced one of the most striking moments of Savage's later career. In 2003, Savage released a rap album called Be a Man. This was not a marketing exercise or a novelty project. It was a direct, genuine, public expression of Savage's professional disdain for the man who had stood beside him during some of the biggest moments in wrestling history. Oh, the album aimed to dismantle the Hulkster persona completely. It contrasted the manufactured bravery of Hogan's on-screen character with what Savage saw as the very real cowardice of the man who played it. Savage challenged Hogan to face him without the cameras and the scripts and the corporate protection. Eye to eye, nose to nose, man to man, no safety net, no prearranged outcome. Hogan never responded, not publicly, not privately. He let the challenge sit in the air unanswered and hoped the world would eventually stop noticing. And to Savage, that silence was the loudest and most complete confirmation of everything he had always suspected. A man with genuine yellow running through him, weak in the heart, hiding behind his relationships and his carefully managed reputation. In Savage's world, that was the most unforgivable kind of failure. Number 9, the Ultimate Warrior. If Hogan represented political weakness, and then the Ultimate Warrior represented something entirely different. He represented weak fundamentals, a genuine inability to do the actual technical work that a high-level professional wrestling career demands. Savage had enormous respect for the excitement the Warrior generated among audiences. He understood what the Warrior meant to the business in terms of energy and spectacle, but admiring a crowd reaction is not the same as respecting the performer creating it. And behind the respect for the noise, Savage had a clear and uncompromising view of what the Warrior was and was not. WrestleMania 7 is remembered by fans as a genuine masterpiece. The career-ending match between Savage and the Warrior is still discussed today as one of the finest pieces of storytelling the business has ever produced. Savage hit 5 consecutive elbow drops. When the reunion with Miss Elizabeth brought the audience to tears and produced one of the most genuinely emotional moments the WWF ever generated. The whole thing was brilliant, but behind that brilliance, Savage was quietly furious about what it actually took to create it. The Warrior was built on a look and an entrance, the face paint, the energy, the rope shaking, the full-speed sprint from the backstage area. That was his world. He was a vivid, explosive, unforgettable character who generated genuine excitement wherever he went. But when it came to the actual craft of constructing a match on the canvas, the Warrior lacked the ability to call it in the ring. He did not have those fundamental tools, and so Savage had to build the entire performance himself. Every single move in their matches was scripted by Savage in advance. Not because Savage wanted to do twice as much work, but because the alternative was chaos. He was effectively carrying the Warrior through performances that would become classics in wrestling history. He was doing his own job and covering for someone else at the same time. Savage once said directly that there are guys who are stars and there are guys who are athletes, and you cannot be a star if you are too weak to learn the fundamentals of the canvas. That quote leaves very little room for interpretation. A great entrance is not a career. A memorable look is not a skill set. And relying on someone else to carry your matches while you provide the atmosphere is, in the Macho Man's view, just another form of professional weakness. Number 8, Lex Luger. During Savage's time in WCW, Lex Luger became a recurring source of backstage friction. Savage viewed Luger as the most obvious and most frustrating example of a particular kind of failure. Luger had every physical tool that the wrestling business prizes at the surface level. The physique was genuinely remarkable, and the look was polished, imposing, and powerful. By every visual standard, Luger appeared to have been built specifically for this business. When you looked at him, you believed in the possibility of a champion. But in Savage's estimation, the visual was almost all there was. Strip away the mirror and the marketing, and very little remained that Savage considered genuinely impressive. Savage famously said that Luger looked like $1,000,000, but moved like a nickel. When that line captures the critique precisely, Luger often phoned in his performances, according to Savage. He relied on the spectacle of his body to carry the audience's attention, while his actual in-ring intensity stayed somewhere backstage. The stiff, genuine, explosive physicality that Savage demanded of himself and everyone he worked alongside was simply absent from Luger's approach to the craft. And the tension between them became significant enough that Savage occasionally refused to enter into working programs with Luger altogether. He believed that Luger's weak intensity would pull down the quality of everything around it, including Savage's own reputation for explosive, high-impact performances. You can carry a physique that looks like it belongs in a championship fight and still have no real soul when it matters. To Savage, Luger was the clearest possible proof of that uncomfortable truth. $1,000,000 exterior built on a nickel's worth of genuine fire. Number 7, Ted DiBiase. The rivalry between Savage and Ted DiBiase, the $1,000,000 Man, was one of the defining narratives of the late 1980s. It culminated at WrestleMania 4 in one of the biggest tournament finals the company had ever staged. Both men were legitimate, high-level professionals. They both had real credibility and genuine ability that the audience recognized and responded to. DiBiase was smooth. He was confident. He knew how to work a crowd and build a story and make people care about what happened at the end of a match. Savage respected the ability. He acknowledged acknowledge the skill, but he carried a private critique of DiBiase that went straight to the core of his beliefs about what the business truly required from its performers. DiBiase was too safe. That was the verdict. Plain and simple and unambiguous. Savage's approach to the craft included an extreme willingness to accept physical risk. He was the man who climbed to the top of 20-foot cages and threw himself off them with a certainty that could only come from someone who had decided that the performance mattered more than his own safety. He accepted the damage because he believed that real damage was the price of an honest performance. He believed it was the truest form of commitment a performer could show to an audience. To Savage, safe was just another word for weak. He believed firmly that a performer who was not willing to bleed for the business simply did not possess the backbone necessary to lead it. Physical risk was not recklessness or foolishness. In Savage's view, it was the most direct possible evidence of real commitment to the audience and to the craft. DiBiase's clean, technically controlled, yet carefully managed style struck Savage as timidity wearing the costume of professionalism. When they shared the ring, Savage pushed for something far more physical and stiff than DiBiase preferred or planned for. He wanted genuine contact. He wanted real urgency. He wanted the audience to feel that something authentic was being decided between these two men. In Savage's world, a match that never got uncomfortable for either performer was a match that was quietly lying to the audience. And lying to the audience through excessive safety was its own particular form of weakness. Number 6. Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. By almost any measure, one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever competed. A man who brought genuine brilliance and longevity to a business that consumes most of its participants. A performer who could walk into an arena at almost any point in his career and command it completely. And yet Randy Savage found weakness in him. Not the same weakness as Luger or the Warrior. Something more personal and, for Savage, far harder to forgive. Because it was not about a lack of ability, it was about a lack of character. And character was, to Savage, ultimately what separated the men from the weak. In 1992, a storyline developed in the WWF that brought the real-life tension between Savage and Flair fully into the public eye. The angle was built around Flair claiming that he had been romantically involved with Miss Elizabeth before Savage was. Flair produced what were described as doctored photographs in WWF magazine to support that claim. Savage found the entire episode personally offensive in a way that no scripted rivalry had ever touched him before. His objection was not with the storytelling itself, wrestling lives on rivalry and controversy and the blurring of fact and fiction. What Savage could not accept was that Flair was using Savage's real marriage as a tool to advance his position and get himself over. That, to Savage, revealed something deeply weak at the center of Flair's character. A willingness to cross a genuine personal line for professional gain. A lack of basic honor that Savage found unforgivable, regardless of what the cameras were doing. He also believed that Flair was imprisoned inside his own gimmick, where the Nature Boy persona was constructed entirely on external validation, on admiration, on the world constantly confirming that Ric Flair was the greatest, the most stylish, the most desired. Savage viewed that need for constant external approval as internal fragility. A truly strong man does not require the world to keep telling him he is great. He knows it himself because he earns it every single night. Flair, in Savage's estimation, could not look in the mirror without needing what looked back to keep confirming his own worth. That was not confidence. That was a sequined robe draped over something genuinely brittle. Number 5. Triple H. As Savage moved through the later years of his career and watched the wrestling world transform around him, a new generation of performers rose to prominence. And Savage aimed his sharpest critique at one of the most successful of that generation. Triple H, the Game. To Savage, Triple H represented something troubling about the direction the business was heading. Savage held the view that the performers of his era were physically and mentally harder than what came after. Those men wrestled 300 days a year on floors that were not padded and in halls that were not equipped with the productions and supports of modern television. They built their positions through sheer will and intensity before the cameras even arrived. Once they earned everything without the benefit of polished presentation making up the difference. Triple H, in Savage's view, had risen to the very top of the industry, not primarily through that kind of grit, but through his political connections. His marriage into the McMahon family created a network of protection that Savage saw as the modern version of the corporate cowardice he had always despised. Not earning the top position through undeniable work. Securing it through relationships that meant the hard questions never had to be answered. Savage's view of Triple H was captured in one sharp, direct line. He said Triple H was playing a game, but in Savage's world, the game was real, and Hunter was just a weak piece in it. This was not simply criticism of one performer. It was an indictment of an entire cultural shift in the wrestling business. Polished production and political relationships force, replacing raw intensity and earned credibility. The backbone that Savage's era demanded had been gradually replaced by something softer and more managed. Connections opening doors that ability alone might not have reached. Triple H in Savage's eyes was the face of that softness, the symbol of a generation that had traded grit for comfort and called it success. Number 4, Buff Bagwell. In WCW, Savage had no patience at all for Marcus Buff Bagwell. The Buff gimmick was built entirely on narcissism, a character obsessed with his own physique, his own reflection, the admiration of the audience for his appearance rather than his actual work rate inside the ring. Everything about the presentation was designed to make Bagwell look impressive, and Savage believed deeply and consistently that this kind of vanity was almost always a decorative shell placed over something fragile and insufficient underneath it. Savage had a term for performers like Bagwell. He called them paper tigers, and they walked in looking dangerous. They talked like men who could back it up when the pressure arrived and the lights were on. But when genuine intensity came into the ring with them, when the work got physically stiff and genuinely demanding, the paper tiger crumpled. Bagwell, in Savage's assessment, could not handle the level of physical contact that Savage considered a basic professional standard. When the Macho Man's elbow was coming down for real, a Bagwell was not built to receive it with the composure of a genuine professional. This low estimation was visible in how Savage conducted himself around Bagwell during their shared time in WCW. In tag team situations, Savage's professional disrespect for his partner was not hidden or subtle. It was deliberate and clear. It was Savage's way of making his position known to everyone in the building. A narcissistic gimmick placed on top of fragile foundations is not a performer. Aren't in the Macho Man's world, it is just a more decorated version of weakness. Number 3, Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious was enormous. There is no other word that quite captures it. His physical presence in any room, in any arena, was impossible to ignore. He was genuinely imposing in a way that only a handful of performers in the entire history of this business have ever achieved. And yet Randy Savage thought he was weak, not physically, not in size or strength or raw intimidation, weak in his mind, weak in his focus, weak in his commitment to the business that was supposed to be his vocation and his life. Savage famously pointed to Sid's preference for playing softball over meeting his professional wrestling obligations as the clearest possible example of the weakness he identified in him. To some people, that might seem like an extreme reaction to what sounds like a minor thing. A man enjoys a sport in his free time. What is the harm in that? To Savage, it was not minor at all, and it was not about free time. It was a window directly into a man's priorities. Wrestling in Savage's world did not leave time for the priorities of someone who was only half committed to it. To Savage, wrestling was a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week calling. It demanded your complete attention and your complete dedication every single day. And anyone who allowed an outside interest to pull their focus away from the craft was demonstrating with complete clarity that they had never truly understood what this business required of them. Sid had the size, he had the presence, he had every physical gift the business could want, and he was apparently willing to walk away from the building when a softball match was on offer. Savage described Sid as a giant with a small-time mind, and he said Sid was too weak to stay in the building when the sun came out and a softball diamond was calling. That is a devastating summary. All that size, all that physical presence, all that potential power and intimidation, and none of it backed by the mental stamina and focus required to be a genuine legend at the highest level of the business. A distracted mind inside a large body is still a weak mind. And in Savage's world, weak minds produced weak performers, regardless of how imposing they appeared from a distance. Number 2, Bret Hart. This one sits differently from all the others on this list. Savage and Bret Hart were not enemies. There was no bitter, lasting public grudge between them. There was genuine mutual respect between two athletes who both understood the business at a deep and serious level. In 1987, they produced a match together where Savage's leg selling was described by those who witnessed it as truly extraordinary, or as otherworldly even. Both men were serious about their craft. Both were committed professionals who brought real intelligence and real skill to every performance they gave. The respect was genuine, and yet Savage still found a weakness in Hart. And because it was subtler than everything else on this list, it tells you something particularly revealing about how precisely the Macho Man's mind actually worked. Hart was quiet, methodical, technically precise. His approach to wrestling was intelligent, clean, serious, and deeply controlled. He was an exceptional performer by almost any standard in the world, but Savage viewed that quiet seriousness as something that could be dangerously misread by the audience. He felt that Hart's style, excellent as it was on a technical level, was dry, that it lacked the explosive, manic, larger-than-life intensity that Savage believed was essential to truly commanding an audience and carrying the business forward. In Savage's estimation, action, quiet can be mistaken for weak. To be a king in this industry, you needed to scream. You needed your energy to fill every corner of the building. You needed to make every person in every seat feel that the entire world was about to end or be saved in the next 5 minutes of action. Hart's methodical, precise, thoughtful approach produced brilliant matches. But to Savage, it lacked the explosive backbone required to lead the business by sheer force of personality. When this critique had nothing to do with Hart's technical skill, which Savage respected completely. It was entirely about fire, about the scream that Savage believed every true king needed to possess. Hart had the craft. In Savage's view, he lacked the madness that turns craft into legend. Number 1, Vince McMahon. This is the one that ran deepest. This is the wound that never properly healed. This is where the verdict stopped being about professional standards and became about something far more personal and far more permanent. Of all 10 names on this list, only this one produced a grudge that shaped the entire final chapter of Savage's career. In 1993, Vince McMahon made a decision about Randy Savage. He moved him away from active competition in the ring and placed him at the commentary table. He sat the Macho Man down with a headset and a microphone and told him that his future was in broadcasting rather than performing. The Macho Man was now an announcer. The man who had climbed cages and thrown himself off turnbuckles and dragged brilliant matches out of performers who could not have done it without him was now going to sit in a suit and describe what other people were doing. The man who was the craft was now going to narrate the craft from a distance. Savage was devastated, and he was furious in a way that did not dim with time. He believed with absolute certainty that he was still in his physical prime when that decision was made. He believed there were years of top-level championship quality work still in his body and his mind. He believed he could still perform at the highest level the company could offer, and he believed that McMahon had given him a personal promise to keep him in that ring for as long as he could perform at that level. That promise was broken without a proper conversation, without a face-to-face reckoning between two men who had built an enormous amount of shared history together. In Savage's eyes, McMahon was too weak to look him in the eye and deliver that news directly. He believed that McMahon was genuinely scared of what Savage still represented, scared of the Macho Man's shadow, and rather than confront that fear openly and honestly, McMahon chose to quietly move Savage sideways, out of the ring, cut behind a table, out of the spotlight and away from the position his talent deserved. For Savage, this was the ultimate expression of institutional weakness. Not a personal failure, though it was that too. An institutional failure, the kind of weakness that infects an entire organization when the man at the top loses the backbone to have honest conversations with the people who built everything around him. A real leader faces difficult decisions directly. A real leader keeps the promises he makes. McMahon, in Savage's view, failed on both of those counts completely. The fallout was enormous and lasting. Savage departed for WCW. What followed was 2 full decades of distance from the WWE, a 2-decade exile from the company he had helped transform into a global phenomenon. All of it stemming from one decision made without the honesty and backbone that Savage believed a true leader owed to the people who served him. Of all the men on this list, McMahon earned the most lasting verdict, the deepest grudge, the most genuinely unforgivable weakness. Now step back from the list for a moment, because Savage's 10 verdicts did not exist in isolation. They had consequences that moved through the wrestling industry like ripples through water, and some of those ripples are still visible today. The most immediate consequence was on the performers who worked alongside him. Savage's standard pushed his opponents to produce some of the best work of their careers. The pressure he created, the absolute insistence on preparation and intensity at every level, forced everyone around him to raise their game, whether they wanted to or not, even when they found his methods exhausting, even when they resented the weight of his expectations. The performances that came out of those tensions were frequently extraordinary. You can measure this in the quality of the matches he produced across decades and across multiple companies. The Macho Man made the people around him better, even the ones he privately dismissed as weak. And then there was Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth ran through almost everything Savage judged about the men around him. She was his personal barometer of character. His protectiveness of her was total and unwavering in ways that went far beyond what any script required of him. Anyone who disrespected her in real life was not simply a rival in the ring. They were a man who lacked the fundamental backbone to honor the dignity of someone important to him. The Flair storyline using her image as a prop, the Hogan tensions that touched on her role in Savage's world. All of it was filtered through the same lens. How you treated Elizabeth told Savage exactly what kind of man you were beneath the gimmick and the muscles and the championship belts. This personal integration of real-life morality into the world of professional wrestling made his feuds uniquely intense and his judgments of his peers uniquely unforgiving, because they were never purely professional. They were always also moral. And in Savage's moral world, the weakness weakness in character and weakness in commitment were the same sin expressed in different clothes. After all 10 names, after all 4 archetypes, after all those ripple effects through the industry, what does it add up to? Randy Savage spent 30 years waging a crusade against what he saw as the softening of the professional wrestling business. His macho madness was not a performance he put on for the audience. Suddenly, it was a psychological defense against a business he feared was becoming comfortable, safe, politically managed, and fundamentally dishonest in its relationship with effort and sacrifice. Every verdict he delivered, every label of weakness he applied to every man on this list, was Savage drawing a line in the sand, saying clearly what a true king of the ring looked like, what he was made of, what he owed to the craft and to the audience that gave the business its meaning. He refused shortcuts that were readily available to him. He refused corporate protection when it was on offer. He refused to phone in performances when the audience would never have been able to tell the difference. He scripted his matches when calling it in the ring would have been far easier and far less exhausting. He threw himself off cage structures when staying safely on the mat was always an option. And he recorded an entire album to challenge a man publicly when staying quiet would have been the comfortable choice. Every single time there was an easy path in front of him, Savage chose the harder one because the easy path was the weak path. And weakness was the one thing he absolutely refused to be in any area, in any circumstance, at any stage of his life and his career. Some people might look at that list of 10 and see harsh judgments, and some might see a man whose standards were unreasonably high. But when you add it all up, what you really see is a man who held himself to exactly the same standard he applied to everyone else. Savage never asked anything of another performer that he was not already demanding of himself at a higher level. That consistency is what separates a true standard from mere criticism. It is the difference between a man who judges and a man who leads by example. Savage did both, simultaneously, every single time he stepped into a ring. That refusal is his truest legacy. Not the titles, as brilliant as those championship runs were. Not the matches, as extraordinary as the best of them remain to this day. Not the voice or the sunglasses or the catchphrases that are still instantly recognizable decades later. His legacy is the standard, the uncompromising, relentless, 24-hour standard he held himself to and applied to everyone who shared a locker room with him. Muscle may win matches on any given night. A great look may open doors that should probably stay closed. Political connections may keep a performer at the top of a card for longer than their ability alone would justify. But none of those things make a legend. Not in Randy Savage's world. Intensity makes a legend. Preparation makes a legend. The backbone to stand by your word and your craft and your commitment every single day, without exception, without shortcuts, and without a yellow streak anywhere in sight. That is what Savage believed with every part of himself. That is what he lived every single day of his career. That is what he demanded from himself and from everyone who stepped into a ring across from him. And that is why, more than a decade after his passing and long after rivals faded, the standard he set still stands taller than almost anything else the wrestling business has produced. The Macho Man showed us what it looks like when someone truly, completely and permanently refuses to be weak in any arena, at any price. Oh yeah,